The millionaire's son could never walk. What the maid did left everyone in shock. In a world where money can buy almost everything, there remain silences no fortune can ever fill. On the crest of a hill outside the city, the Ellington estate rose like a fortress of power and extravagance. Heavy iron gates, marble-paved paths, towering walls draped in ivy. Together they painted a portrait of prosperity, yet behind them lay a sorrow wealth could never cure. Richard Ellington, a renowned tech magnate known for his cold precision and relentless ambition, was the master of this domain. A man respected by every corner of the business world, he had built a multi-billion-dollar empire. But for all his power, he was helpless before the one thing he longed for most: to see his son walk like other children. Samuel Ellington, only 10 years old, had lived with motionless legs since birth. Dozens of specialists and celebrated doctors had passed through the mansion, each carrying promises, but all leaving behind nothing but disappointment, and another crack in the fragile heart of the boy. Within that vast residence, another figure quietly stepped into their lives. Calorona Hayes, once a hospital nurse, now reduced to part-time caregiving work for the Ellington family. Unlike the dazzling glow of the household she served, Calorona carried with her a simple silence, almost invisible. Her silhouette in pale uniform blended into the marble walls, making her easy to overlook. Yet her eyes, bright, earnest, and enduring, held what the entire mansion lacked: understanding and trust. That morning, the sun had barely risen, its pale gold rays filtering through long curtains that brushed the floor. Richard busied himself in his office while a small army of servants moved through the estate in their routine. Only one sound shattered the solemn order: the furious cries of Samuel echoing from the last room down the hall. That cry pierced into Calorona's heart, a heart too familiar with the pain of patience she had once nursed. Samuel's cries were not the cries of a child demanding a toy. They were the shattered sounds of a small soul slowly losing all hope. He screamed, hurling toys onto the floor, slamming his wheelchair into the wooden desk so hard the noise rang sharply through the corridor. "I don't want this anymore. Nobody can help me." His voice cracked between sobs. Calorona stood only a few steps away, a cleaning cloth still in her hands. She had heard these outbursts many times since arriving at the estate, but this time something was different. The despair in Samuel's voice pressed heavily against her chest. She paused her work and listened. In the adjoining room, Richard Ellington spoke into the phone, his tone as sharp as a blade. He was negotiating a contract worth hundreds of millions, utterly oblivious to his son's cries. To Richard, these emotional outbursts were merely symptoms of the condition, a problem that, in his mind, only money and science could fix. The mansion's long corridor seemed to embody the invisible gulf between father and son. On one side, a world of numbers, stocks, and power. On the other, a small boy trapped in his wheelchair, imprisoned by his own body. Calorona edged closer to Samuel's door, pushing it ajar. The spacious room was adorned with paintings, shelves of books, and glass cabinets filled with imported toys. Yet all of it only amplified the emptiness. At the room's center, Samuel hunched in his chair, fists clenched, his eyes swollen and red from crying. Memories rushed back to Calorona, of young patients she once cared for in the hospital, children who battled terminal illnesses yet somehow managed to smile. Samuel was different. His smile had been stolen too long ago, replaced by fury and despair. "Samuel," she whispered softly, but the boy didn't answer. He turned his face toward the wall. In that moment, Calorona felt something unusual. Though she was not his mother, not his doctor, her heart urged her to act, not out of duty, but because before her sat a child silently crying out for help. Far down the hall, Richard continued discussing the company's future, his voice carrying like a cold echo. The contrast only deepened Samuel's loneliness. He didn't need another specialist, another costly treatment plan. What he needed, Calirona realized, was someone to believe in him, to see him as a boy, not a diagnosis. She set the cloth aside and drew a deep breath. Her gaze found its way to him, and in that moment Samuel lifted his tear-streaked face. His eyes filled not with arrogance, but with a desperate plea. One glance, enough to change everything. The room fell silent after the sobs faded. Samuel sat still, his small shoulders trembling with exhaustion, his tear-stained eyes fixed on Calirona. In that instant, she knew, if she didn't act, the fragile spark of hope inside him would extinguish completely. Drawing a steady breath, Calirona stepped forward. She knelt down until her eyes met his. Her green eyes locked with his reddened ones, a gaze wordless, yet overflowing with meaning. "Samuel," she said softly, her voice low and warm, "you've tried with so many doctors, haven't you? But today, will you try with me? Just today. No one has to know." The boy stared at her, his brows furrowing in doubt. Everyone before her had come bearing promises, leaving only disappointment behind. Why should this time be different? Calirona extended her hand, palm open. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll do this together. Just once." The air tightened as if strung on a wire. Samuel hesitated, his gaze darting around the room as though searching for an excuse to refuse. Then, with an unexpected decision, he placed his trembling, icy hands into hers. He clutched her as though she were the only anchor in a stormy sea. "Trust me, just today," Calirona whispered. She gently touched his knees, adjusting his posture. "Can you feel the carpet beneath your feet? It's been waiting for you for so long." Morning light spilled through the windows, laying a golden path across the Persian rug. It was like a silent invitation, patient yet filled with promise. Samuel swallowed hard. "What if I fall?" His voice was scarcely more than a breath. "Then I'll catch you, but today you won't fall." Calirona's voice was steady, her eyes blazing with conviction. His heart pounded, his grip tightening around her hand. Every second stretched into eternity. Then, with all the courage he could gather, Samuel lifted his right foot. The movement was shaky, awkward, like a fledgling bird attempting its first flight. The room seemed to freeze. When his small foot finally pressed into the carpet, a timid smile flickered across his face. "That's it," Calirona encouraged softly. "Good. Now the other foot." The second step wavered less, the third almost steady. Samuel felt every muscle protesting after years of stillness, yet something stronger propelled him forward. Calirona's unwavering faith. On the fourth step, his legs gave way, but instead of hitting the floor, Samuel collapsed into Calirona's steady embrace. He fell against her chest, breathless yet strangely radiant. Tears spilled down Calirona's cheeks, hot and unstoppable. They were not tears of pity, but of profound joy, of belief vindicated. "You walked, Samuel," she whispered. "You really walked." The boy lifted his flushed face, his cheeks glowing with determination. "Tomorrow, I want to take 5 steps." The door suddenly burst open, slamming against the wall. Richard Ellington stood at the threshold, his frame filling the entire space like a looming shadow. His eyes swept across the scene before him. Calirona Hayes knelt before his son, her hand still holding Samuel's arm, while the boy beamed with a radiant smile of both exhaustion and triumph. "What do you think you're doing?" The businessman's voice was as cold as a blade. The calculating gaze that had conquered boardrooms now carried a toxic mix of fear and fury. "Stay away from my son, immediately." Calirona rose slowly, her hands trembling. "Mr. Ellington, I only wanted to help. Samuel just walked a few steps and—" Silence. Richard stormed into the room, planting himself between her and the child. Who gave you the right to touch him, to play the role of a physical therapist? The best specialists in this country couldn't achieve it. And you think you can just— Father, please, Samuel pleaded, tears streaming down his face. Miss Calorona helped me. I walked, Father. I walked. The man ignored his son's desperate words, his face contorted with offended authority. He pointed to the door. Get out of my house, now. You're fired. Calorona felt her stomach sink. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was being torn away from Samuel, the boy who had connected with her in a way no one else had. Please, let me explain. Explanations won't change anything. Leave before I call security. Clinging to a shred of dignity despite her broken heart, Calorona picked up her bag, casting one last glance at Samuel, sobbing uncontrollably. You'll be all right, she whispered, though she knew it was likely a lie. She strode down the hallway with steady steps, ignoring the curious stares of the staff. The garden's scent of fresh lilies mocked the beauty she had just been denied. Richard followed her outside, seemingly intent on personally ensuring her departure. As they passed the koi pond, a harsh hand gripped her shoulder. With brutal force, he shoved her down. The icy water swallowed her whole, drenching her clothes and dignity alike. The shock stole her breath. When she surfaced, coughing violently, she saw Richard standing at the edge, his gaze cold and calculating. To remind you of your place, he said, turning back toward the house, leaving Calorona soaked and humiliated, but not broken. Rising from the freezing water, Calorona knew this wasn't the end. Something had begun in that room, and not even Richard Ellington could stop it. That night, the Ellington mansion was eerily quiet. Richard Ellington paced another round of the silent hallway, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing down on him. The absence of Calorona was like a ghost haunting his every step. 3 a.m, and sleep continued to elude him. He stopped at the window, staring at the garden bathed in moonlight, the koi pond reflecting silver, the very place where he had humiliated her just hours ago. The image of Calorona soaked through, yet her eyes still holding dignity despite the humiliation, haunted him. Richard rubbed his weary face and walked into his study. Sitting down, he pulled up the security system. He needed to understand what had truly happened before he entered that room. The cameras had captured everything. He saw Calorona kneeling before Samuel, her lips moving in words the microphone didn't quite catch. Then it happened. His son, the child countless specialists had sworn would never walk, took unsteady steps in her hands. Samuel's face glowed with a joy Richard hadn't witnessed in years, a joy money had never been able to buy. My God, he whispered, collapsing into the leather chair. He watched it again, and again, 5 times. Each time he noticed more. Calorona's patience, Samuel's trustful eyes, the genuine bond between them. A violent wave of shame rose inside him, forcing him to his feet. He poured a glass of whiskey and downed it in one gulp. Everything he believed about order, about status, about who deserved respect, collapsed before that simple scene. The woman he had treated like disposable trash had achieved what millions of dollars in treatment could not. He climbed the stairs, stopping before his son's room. He cracked the door open and saw Samuel tossing in restless sleep, clutching the teddy bear Calorona had mended weeks earlier. Richard approached, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his son's face. "What have I done?" he whispered. For the first time in years, Richard Ellington wept, silently, the tears of a man realizing his pride and prejudice had cost him far too much. By the time the first rays of dawn pierced the curtains, he had decided. He would find Calorona Hayes and beg for her forgiveness, not just for himself, but for Samuel, the boy who deserved far more than a father blinded by privilege. At 6 a.m, Richard grabbed his car keys. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough to mend what had been broken. At daybreak, Calorona startled at the pounding on her small apartment door. Wrapping herself in an old robe, she crossed the tiny room, wondering who could be there at such an hour. When she opened the door, her heart skipped. Richard Ellington stood there, disheveled as she had never seen him. The businessman, always pristine in tailored suits, now looked like he hadn't slept all night. Hair rumpled, shirt wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes. "Calorona, he began, his voice thick. "I've watched the cameras all night. I saw what you did for Samuel." She stood silent, arms crossed, the cold wind from the door no sharper than the ice in her eyes. "I need you for Samuel." "Please forgive me," Richard pleaded, his voice strained. The cold eyes that once commanded boardrooms now brimmed with something she had never seen in him before. Pure desperation. "You humiliated me," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "You threw me into the water like garbage." The man bowed his head, unable to face her accusing gaze. "I know, it's unforgivable, but my son, he needs you. No doctor has done what you achieved in minutes." Calorona looked at the powerful man, now simply a father, broken on her doorstep. It wasn't just a plea, it was a complete surrender, a man of the elite bowing before a maid. "I didn't do it for you," she said after a long pause. "I did it for Samuel. He doesn't deserve to pay for adult mistakes." Relief flickered across Richard's face, mingled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. I'll double your salary, give you a better room, anything." "I don't want money," she cut him off. "I want respect, and I want Samuel to have a real chance." When Calorona closed the door to change clothes, she knew she was stepping back into dangerous ground. The Ellington estate wasn't just a house, it was a minefield of prejudice and expectation. But Samuel's face, his radiant smile when he took his first steps, was worth every battle to come. Calorona passed through the mansion's great gates, her heart racing. The once serene garden now seemed hostile. She noticed the gardener avoiding her eyes, pretending to fuss over perfectly trimmed bushes. In the main hall, the housekeeper only gave her a curt nod, not the usual morning greeting. Drawing a deep breath, she walked on, feeling the weight of countless stairs trailing her down the corridor. Whispers ceased when she drew near, only to flare behind her back. "She actually dared to come back," one maid hissed to another, not bothering to lower her voice. "They say she bewitched Mr. Ellington. Even Mr. Hargrave, usually the picture of propriety, avoided her, as if her very presence violated some unspoken rule." At lunch in the staff kitchen, Calorona sat alone. The silence was deafening, broken only by the clink of cutlery. She ate quickly to escape the suffocating atmosphere. By the time she reached Samuel's room on the East Wing's second floor, the tight knot in her throat began to ease. The boy sat by the window, flipping through an adventure book. When he saw her, his eyes lit up like stars. "Calorona!" Samuel cried, dropping the book and stretching his arms toward her. He tried to rise from his wheelchair, managing 3 unsteady steps before she rushed forward to catch him. His tight embrace shattered every wall she had built to protect herself. Silent tears slid down her cheeks as she held him. "You really came back?" he whispered into her shoulder. "They said you wouldn't." "I'm here," she said, wiping her tears and meeting his eyes. "And what's next? We'll keep going, right?" The radiant smile on Samuel's face was pure hope. In that smile, Calorona found the reason to return, the strength to endure every stare, every whisper, every slight. For him, she could not falter. "Let me show you what I practiced while you were gone," she said, brushing away the last of her tears. Samuel nodded with fierce determination. In that room, far from judgmental eyes, the true battle for his recovery and for Calorona's dignity began. Days wove into weeks, stitched together by tiny victories. Samuel, once confined to his wheelchair, now took surer steps across the living room carpet. Calorona watched with quiet pride as he gripped her hand, determined to conquer each inch of ground. "3 more steps today, Calorona." "I did 3 more," Samuel exclaimed, his eyes bright as he balanced for precious seconds before reaching for her hand again. Neither of them noticed Richard standing just beyond the half-closed door. He was overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Pride in his son's progress no specialist had delivered, turmoil at having misjudged Calorona, and something else growing inside him that he dared not yet name. "Breathe deeply and trust your legs," Calorona said calmly, her hand steadying Samuel's elbow. "Your body remembers what to do. You only need to believe it." Richard realized his son looked at Calorona with complete admiration and trust, a kind of faith he, as a father, had never received. Quietly, he withdrew, his heart unbearably heavy. Calorona's return brought not only hope for Samuel, but also stirred hidden storms within the Ellington family. Word of the unknown nurse who had helped Samuel stand traveled quickly among the staff, then seeped into the conversations of the powerful. It wasn't long before the news reached the ears of a woman whose presence always signaled a coming storm. Eleanor Ellington. Eleanor, Richard's elder sister, had long been a fixture of New York high society, cold, proud, and ruthlessly protective of the family's reputation. Rumors that Richard had allowed a stranger with no pedigree to step into Samuel's life were, to her, nothing short of disgraceful. On the day of her return, the Ellington mansion seemed to freeze. The sharp echo of her heels struck the marble floor, each step heavy with warning. Draped in a luxurious coat, her eyes cutting like glass, she entered with a presence that made even the oldest servants bow their heads. Calorona was guiding Samuel through his exercises when the door swung open. Eleanor stood there, scanning them from head to toe. Her gaze carried the disdain of one appraising a trinket far beneath her standards. "So, this is Miss Hayes my brother has been praising?" Eleanor's voice was smooth, yet hard as steel. "Remarkable how someone like you can cause so much disruption." Samuel shifted nervously in his chair, glancing toward Calorona. "Aunt Eleanor, she's helping me. I've taken a few steps." "My dear," Eleanor replied, her eyes never leaving Calorona, "I came back precisely to ensure you're cared for by qualified professionals, not by dreamers turning this mansion into an experiment." Calorona didn't flinch. She met Eleanor's gaze squarely, her tone steady. "I don't seek your approval. I only care about Samuel." A faint smile curled on Eleanor's lips. "Everyone has a price, Miss Hayes. I'll find yours soon enough." From that day, the silent war began. Tabloids suddenly carried headlines smearing Calorona. "Ambitious nurse seeks to climb through the Ellington fortune," or "Unqualified woman risks child's health." Paparazzi photos of her training Samuel were twisted into supposed evidence of exploitation. At dinner, Richard frowned as he read the paper, while Samuel angrily crumpled the page. "They're lying. She's not like that." But Eleanor sat calmly, sipping her wine, as if the words were merely another step in her elaborate plan. In the halls, Calorona felt the stares of the staff, heard the whispers behind her back, yet she did not retreat. Each morning she entered Samuel's room, took his small hand, and walked him forward, step by step. Every step the boy managed was a living refutation of every lie. Eleanor watched it all, her icy eyes missing nothing. To preserve the Ellington name, she knew Calorona must be erased, and for Eleanor this was only the beginning of war. Even so, Calorona did not break. Each morning she lifted her head and walked into the estate, ignoring the camera flashes and shameless questions. When a reporter blocked Samuel during one of his rare visits to the garden, Calorona stepped in front of him. "He's just a child. Please, have some decency." At night, alone in her small room, she allowed herself to cry, not because of the lies and the humiliation, but because of the injustice of a world that could not believe a woman might simply want to help a child learn to walk without expecting anything in return. "I will not abandon you," she promised Samuel the next day as she helped him practice. "No matter what they say." That night, alone in his study, Richard stared at the framed family photographs on the wall. Awards, certificates of honor, handshakes with important figures. Suddenly, all of it felt hollow. True value, he now understood, lay in the genuine smile Calorona had awakened in his son. Eleanor Ellington stepped into the laundry room where Calorona was folding bedsheets fragrant with softener. The sharp scent of Eleanor's expensive perfume clashed with the clean, gentle smell of fresh fabric. "We need to talk," she said, carefully closing the door. Her lips carried their calculated smile as she opened an Italian leather purse. Calorona kept folding, eyes quietly following the woman's every movement. When Eleanor placed a thick envelope on the small table, the air grew heavy. 100,000, she announced. "For you to disappear from my nephews and my brother's lives. No scenes, no drama. Just vanish." Calorona looked at the envelope, then at Eleanor. Her hands paused over the fabric, but her stance remained firm. "I can double it if that's not enough." Eleanor misread the silence as bargaining. Calorona drew a deep breath. "My worth is not for sale, Mrs. Ellington." The woman laughed in disbelief. "Everyone has a price, especially someone in your position." "Perhaps in your world," Calorona pushed the envelope back. "But not in mine." Eleanor lost her composure. "Do you think you belong in this family? That Richard would ever allow a maid to become more than that?" At that moment the door burst open. Richard stood in the doorway, his face pale with contained fury. "Get out of my room," Calorona said, her voice low but unyielding. Eleanor quickly brushed past her brother, avoiding his eyes. Richard remained frozen, the envelope still on the table, like evidence of betrayal. "How much did she offer you?" he finally asked. "It doesn't matter," Calorona replied, turning back to the folded linens. That night, heated arguments echoed through the corridors. Staff pretended not to hear while Richard confronted his sister. Words like manipulation and prejudice cut through the thick walls. Mr. Hargrave served dinner in silence, noting how the master of the house didn't touch a single bite. He observed the tension, realizing family loyalty was being tested as never before. In Samuel's room, Calorona told him a bedtime story, shielding him from the storm outside. She knew that refusing the money had accelerated a fracture that could no longer be avoided. That night, Richard sat motionless in his study, the desk lamp casting his shadow long across the wall, lined with portraits. To his eyes, the frames that once represented success now looked like empty masks. He could still hear his sister's voice echoing from the corridor. "She will never belong to this family," and felt his chest grow heavier. For the first time, he wondered if family was meant to protect or to imprison. The next morning, Samuel was practicing again with Calorona in the grand living room. The boy staggered forward a few steps, sweat glistening on his brow, but his face was radiant. Calorona encouraged him gently. "Well done. Just one more step, Samuel." From a distance, Richard watched his son, his chest tightening. He remembered the doctor's verdict. He will never be able to. Yet here, each small step sounded like a hammer blow, breaking the chains of the past. Eleanor appeared on the staircase, her cold gaze fixed on the scene below. Richard turned to face her, no longer avoiding her eyes. "I will not let my son live in a house where love is dismissed. If you wish to call that betrayal, then so be it." For the first time, Eleanor had no reply. She turned away in silence, her heels striking the marble floor with a hollow finality. She knew the secret war was over, and the Ellington family's pride could not shake the simple truth. Love and trust were more powerful than money or power. Richard walked toward Calorona and Samuel. Kneeling beside his son, his trembling hand rested on the boy's shoulder. "I'm proud of you," he whispered, his voice breaking. Samuel looked up, his eyes shining with a joy Richard had not seen in years. Then he turned to Calorona. The words caught in his throat, but his eyes spoke for him, no longer cold, but full of gratitude and regret. "I won't ask for your forgiveness now," Richard said at last, "but please give me the chance to become the father Samuel deserves." Calorona was silent for a moment, then gave a small nod. "I'll stay, for Samuel. But respect is something you must learn and prove day by day." In the room once suffocated by prejudice, the air seemed lighter. Samuel laughed as he managed 2 more steps, stumbled, then stood again. Calorona rushed to steady him, and this time Richard reached out too. For the first time, the 3 of them stood together, holding balance for a child who refused to give up. Outside, the morning sun stretched across the koi pond. The Ellington estate still loomed tall and imposing, but within its heavy walls, something had changed. A family learning how to begin again, not through power, but through love and trust. A year had passed. The seasons had changed, and so had Samuel's steps. From those first trembling, uncertain strides, he could now walk from the window to the sofa in the grand living room without holding on to anyone. Every step was a victory, living proof of the love and faith Calorona had planted in him. Richard Ellington stood in the garden, watching his son practice under the morning sun, roses blooming all around. His heart had never felt lighter. Beside Samuel was Calorona, her hair brushing softly in the breeze, her eyes steady and full of warmth. Richard knew that without her, both he and Samuel might still be trapped in the shadows of prejudice and despair. The bond between Richard and Calorona, which began as gratitude, had deepened into something unshakable. He had learned humility, learned to listen, while she had learned to believe that even doors once sealed could open to a new future. Every dinner, the 3 of them sat together, listening to Samuel's lively stories. Every morning, Richard and Calorona guided him into the garden so his small legs could continue their journey of hope. One June afternoon, by the koi pond where once tragedy had scarred them, Richard knelt down. But this time there was no cruelty, no humiliation, only a small velvet box in his hand. Samuel stood nearby, his smile wide enough to show the dimples in his cheeks. "Calorona Hayes," Richard began, his voice trembling but certain. "This past year you've given my son the world and given me a chance to begin again. I can't promise perfection, but I vow to spend the rest of my life loving you, respecting you, and raising Samuel by your side. Will you marry me?" Calorona froze, tears spilling as memories of the past flooded back. This man had once humiliated her by the koi pond, had once cast her out of his home. And yet, in that very place of pain, he now knelt, not as a magnate, but as a man stripped of pride, asking her to share his life. She looked at Samuel and saw him nod eagerly, his eyes filled with hope. Her heart softened. "Yes," she whispered, then nodded firmly. Richard slipped the ring onto her hand, and Samuel shouted with joy, "Mom! Dad!" the first time he called them so, as if the family was finally whole. The wedding took place in the estate's sunlit garden, overflowing with white flowers and golden light. The staff, some of whom had once whispered against Calorona, stood in awe as she walked in a simple but elegant gown, hand in hand with Richard, while Samuel proudly carried the rings, his face glowing with joy. Among the guests was Eleanor Ellington. She wore a deep blue gown, regal as ever, but her eyes were subdued. No one knew what she thought during the ceremony, But when Richard and Calorona exchanged vows and their first kiss as husband and wife, Eleanor quietly turned aside, her eyes glistening. Later, after the celebration, when the music had faded and the sun dipped low, Eleanor sought Calorona out in the quiet of the garden. "Calorona," she said softly, her voice smaller than ever before. "A year ago I insulted you and tried to drive you away. I thought I was protecting my family, but really I was clinging to blind prejudice. Today, watching Richard, watching Samuel, I see that it was you who saved this family." Calorona listened in silence, searching Eleanor's eyes for the pride that once dominated them. But for the first time, she saw sincerity. Eleanor extended her hand. "I am sorry, and I wish you, Richard and Samuel, nothing but happiness." In that moment, Calorona saw the cracks in Eleanor's pride. She gently took the older woman's hand. "I forgive you, not only for what you did, but for everything that has passed. We've all learned something." Eleanor nodded faintly and turned away, her expression calmer, almost at peace. That night, in a room fragrant with flowers, Richard took Calorona's hand and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up. Because of you, I have my son. I have my family. I have myself again." Calorona smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Outside, Samuel slept peacefully, his mended teddy bear still in his arms. And within their hearts, one truth rang clear. This family was not built by wealth, power, or bloodline, but by love, trust, and forgiveness. The story closed not with an ending, but with a beginning, the beginning of a complete happiness within the Ellington estate, once filled with shadows, now radiant with the light of love and hope.